Chen stared at the canvas, its pristine white surface a mockery. It had been weeks, perhaps months, since he'd truly seen anything worth painting. His tiny studio apartment, once a vibrant explosion of color and half-finished masterpieces, now felt like a tomb of creative failures. A colleague acrylic cracked on palettes, brushes lay stiff and forgotten in murky water, and the air hung heavy with the scent of dust and stale coffee, not turpentine. Bills, stark and unforgiving, were stacked on a wobbly easel, their red ink screaming louder than any muse ever had. He was good, he knew he was, but talent didn't pay the rent, and inspiration, it seemed, had packed its bags and left without a forwarding address. A sharp rap on the door, unusually formal, pulled him from his self-pitying reverie. He dragged himself across the cramped space, past a sculpture of twisted metal that seemed to groan under its own weight, and peered through the peephole. A stern-faced man in an impeccably tailored suit stood on the landing, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. Chen opened the door a crack. "Mr. Chen," the man inquired, his voice as crisp as his suit. "I am Mr. Albright, from the agent and the guard solicitors. I have an urgent matter regarding the estate of your great-aunt, Eleanor Vance." Eleanor Vance. The name was a ghost from a past Chen barely remembered, a fleeting image of a stern woman with piercing eyes from a faded photograph. He hadn't known she was still alive, let alone that he was related. He took the envelope, heavy and official, and closed the door, his heart thumping an unfamiliar rhythm. The letter inside was precise, almost clinical. Eleanor Vance. It stated, had passed away 3 weeks prior, and in a surprising turn of events, had bequeathed her entire estate to her grandnephew, Chen. The estate, Mr. Albright's letter detailed, consisted primarily of a property, an old lighthouse situated on a remote, windswept headland miles from the nearest town. It was, the solicitor warned, in a considerable state of disrepair. Chen read the words isolated, dilapidated, and remote several times, a strange tremor running through him. His first instinct was to dismiss it, to sell whatever relic this woman had left him and pay off his burgeoning debts. But then, an image began to form in his mind. A solitary tower against a furious sky battered by centuries of ocean rage. His artistic eye, dormant for so long, twitched awake. He pulled up satellite images, the figure view. The lighthouse stood like a sentinel on the very edge of the world, its whitewashed stone flaking, its iron lantern room a rusted crown. The surrounding land was a desolate expanse of rock and scrub, the nearest sign of civilization a distant smudge on the horizon. It was magnificent in its ruin, a testament to endurance and decay. The structure wasn't just old, it was ancient, its very stones seeming to hum with forgotten stories. The windows, dark and vacant, looked like eyes staring out to sea, not in welcome, but with an unnerving, knowing gaze. A spark, faint but insistent, ignited within Chen. This wasn't just a property. It was a canvas, a sculpture, a muse. The desolation, the isolation, the sheer, raw power of the place. It called to something deep within him. A craving for authenticity that his current life lacked. He envisioned stormy seas crashing against its base, sunlight glinting off its weathered glass, the stark contrast of human architecture against untamed nature. It was unsettling, yes, but also profoundly beautiful in a way his polished city life could never be. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and arrangements. Mr. Albright, clearly accustomed to more straightforward inheritances, sounded bewildered by Chen's eagerness. "It's quite remote, Mr. Chen. No utilities, barely a road. A person you quite sure?" Chen was sure. He packed a minimal bag, grabbed his oldest sketchbook and a box of charcoals, leaving behind the mocking canvases and the unpaid bills. This was not just an escape. It was a pilgrimage. He needed to feel the grit under his fingernails. The salt on his tongue, the wind tearing at his clothes. He needed to create again, and this lighthouse, this crumbling monument to a forgotten past, felt like the only place it could happen. The drive was long, stretching for hours beyond the last gas station, then the last village, then the last paved road. The landscape grew increasingly barren, the sky vast and indifferent. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying the unmistakable tang of the sea. And then, there it was. A witness on a craggy promontory, silhouetted against a bruised late-afternoon sky, stood the lighthouse. It was larger, more imposing than any photograph had conveyed. The stone, once white, was now streaked with gray and black, like weeping scars. An officer of moss clung stubbornly to its northern face, vibrant green against the muted stone. The iron railing around the lantern room was a tangle of rust, some sections broken, dangling precariously. The glass panels, where they remained, were opaque with salt spray and grime, reflecting the fading light in fractured, distorted shards. A profound silence enveloped the place, broken only by the relentless roar of the ocean below. There was no other structure in sight, just the lighthouse and the endless churning expanse of the sea. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt dormant, as if it merely awaited a command to awaken. Chen stepped out of his car, the wind immediately whipping his hair across his face, tugging at his jacket. He took a deep, bracing breath, the air cold and clean, laced with salt and something else. A faint metallic scent, like old iron and damp earth. He walked closer, his boots crunching on gravel and broken shells. The massive wooden door, warped and peeling, was secured by a heavy, rusted padlock. He ran his hand over the cold, rough stone of the tower, feeling the centuries etched into its surface. This was it. This was his inheritance. It was decaying, yes, crumbling even, but there was an undeniable raw beauty to it. A fierce, untamed aesthetic that spoke directly to his soul. It was a monument to the relentless power of time and nature, a perfect subject for an artist hungry for truth. A shiver, not entirely of cold, ran down his spine. It was unsettling, yes, but in a way that thrilled him, promising a depth of inspiration he hadn't touched in years. He felt a profound sense of belonging, a strange pull toward the dark, silent sentinel. This wasn't just a house. It was a challenge, a canvas, a potential salvation. He just had to unlock its secrets, and perhaps, in doing so, unlock his own. The old colleague groaned under the weight of Chen's supplies, its tires crunching over the gravel path leading to the lighthouse. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant rhythmic sigh of the ocean. A agent hymn, the structure stood, a sentinel against the turbulent sky, its whitewashed brick scarred by time and salt, the lantern room a vacant eye. It was magnificent, stark, and utterly devoid of the mundane clutter that had choked his previous apartment. This wasn't just a change of scenery. It was a defiant declaration against the creative drought that had plagued him for months. A surge of energy, sharp and invigorating, coursed through him. It felt like the static charge before a storm, a precursor to something powerful. He hadn't felt this thrill in ages. The canvas, pristine and mocking in his studio back home, suddenly didn't seem so daunting. Here, within these thick, sea-battered walls, he could feel an echo of grand narratives, of solitude and struggle, of the relentless natural world. Inspiration, he realized, wasn't something to be chased. It was something to be found, often in the most desolate, forgotten places. Aguard the heavy oak door, Chen stepped inside. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp stone and a ghost of salt. A figure motes danced in the slivers of light piercing through grimy windows. The spiral staircase, a dizzying helix of cast iron, beckoned upwards. He decided the main living area, A spacious, circular room on one of the lower levels would serve as his studio. A person-high ceiling and wide, arched windows, though currently obscured by layers of grime, promised spectacular light once cleaned. The next few hours were a blur of physical exertion. He hauled boxes of canvases, tubes of paint, brushes, solvents, and his sturdy wooden easel up the winding stairs. Each trip was a workout, his muscles protesting, but the satisfaction of seeing his tools arranged in their new home fueled him. He cleaned the windows with fierce determination, revealing the wild, churning sea and the endless expanse of the sky. The light, when it finally flooded the room, was breathtaking. A painter's dream, shifting from the soft, pearly glow of morning to the fiery drama of sunset. He set up his easel by the largest window, positioning it so he could gaze out at the horizon, the endless stretch of ocean meeting the sky. He arranged his paints on a makeshift table, uncapped a few tubes, and inhaled their familiar, pungent aroma. It was a scent that had once been synonymous with joy, with purpose. Now it was a promise. He picked up a clean brush, twirled it between his fingers, and felt the familiar weight, the potential. This was it. This was where he would paint again. As he meticulously organized his brushes by size, a faint, almost inaudible sound drifted to him. It was a whisper, a breathy murmur, like dry leaves skittering across stone. He paused, brush midair, and cocked his head. The sound was gone. He listened intently, but heard only the distant shriek of gulls and the tireless murmur of the waves. Just the wind, he muttered to himself, dismissing it. This old place would have its quirks, its drafts, its structural groans. He went back to his task, arranging his charcoal sticks in a small wooden box. Later, as dusk began to bleed into the sky, painting the clouds in bruised purples and oranges, Chen took a break. He'd made good progress, not just in setting up, but in feeling the stirrings of an idea. He walked over to his makeshift table to grab a rag to wipe his hands, but the one he distinctly remembered placing right beside his turpentine jar wasn't there. Instead, it lay crumpled beneath the table, partially hidden by a stack of old newspapers he hadn't yet thrown out. He frowned, a tiny crease forming between his brows. Did I kick that? He wondered aloud. He was usually so careful, so methodical. He bent down, retrieved the rag, and shook his head. A witness have been more tired than he thought. An officer was always disorienting. He spent the evening sketching, filling pages of his sketchbook with quick studies of the waves, the jagged rocks, the stark lines of the lighthouse itself. The light faded, and he lit a single lantern, its warm glow casting dancing shadows across the circular room. He was absorbed, lost in the rhythm of charcoal on paper, the quiet hum of his own revived creativity. He needed a fresh sheet. A detective for the pad on the table beside him, he glanced up, his gaze sweeping across the far wall. In that fleeting moment, just at the edge of his vision, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom near the spiral staircase. It was too quick, too fluid to be merely the play of lantern light. It seemed to move. An indistinct, elongated form, before vanishing as swiftly as it appeared. Chen's head snapped around, his eyes scanning the spot. Nothing. A specialist, the solid, rough-hewn stone wall, dappled with shadows cast by the flickering lantern. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Long day, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Brain playing tricks. He'd been staring at charcoal for hours, his vision likely strained. A technician houses, especially isolated ones, were notorious for their optical illusions, their creaks and groans. He told himself it was the combination of exhaustion, the unfamiliar surroundings, and perhaps a touch of his own overactive imagination finally coming back to life. It was a good sign, he reasoned, a sign that his mind was waking up, even if it was producing phantom shapes. He turned back to his sketchbook, a new energy, tinged with a faint, unacknowledged prickle of unease, urging him on. The house was settling around him, and he, in turn, was settling into the house. Or so he thought. The old colleague had groaned under the weight of Chen's supplies, its tires crunching over the gravel path leading to the lighthouse. He'd cut the engine, the sudden silence of the isolated headland like a physical blow. For 2 days, that silence had been his only companion, save for the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below. He'd meticulously unpacked, setting up his makeshift studio in the cavernous circular room at the base of the tower. Canvases leaning against damp stone, paints and brushes arranged with an almost ritualistic precision. But the block remained. The vast, empty canvases stared back, mocking him with their pristine potential, while his mind felt like a choked well. On the third morning, something shifted. It began subtly, a faint echo in the periphery of his hearing, like the distant creak of old timbers or the sigh of wind through a rusted vent. He dismissed it as the house settling, the sounds of an ancient structure breathing. He sat before a canvas, brush hovering, and felt. A flicker. A colleague, an idea, not yet, but a sensation of imminence. He dipped his brush, not knowing what he would paint, and the bristles touched the canvas. An agent, it exploded. It wasn't a trickle. It was a torrent. His hand moved with an autonomy he'd never experienced, sweeping across the canvas, mixing colors with a furious abandon. The initial uncertainty vanished, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like a surgical incision in his mind. A guard cascaded, one after another, each more vivid and compelling than the last. He didn't just paint, he channeled. He worked for hours, days, losing all sense of time, fueled by an unnatural energy that banished hunger and fatigue. The work was extraordinary. His previous art, while respected, had been grounded in a certain aesthetic distance, an intellectual remove. This new output was raw, visceral, almost painfully intimate. His canvases depicted the lighthouse, but not as a beacon of safety. It was a skeletal finger reaching into a bruised sky, its windows like empty, weeping eyes. He painted the sea, not as a vast, indifferent expanse, but as a writhing, malevolent entity, its waves forming grotesque, grasping hands. A figure emerged from the shadows, not human, not quite, but twisted semblances, their faces obscured by the perpetual gloom of the tower's interior, their forms elongated, distorted by an unseen pressure. There was a recurring motif of a single, unblinking eye, sometimes in the swirl of a storm, sometimes peering from the darkness of a stairwell, always observing. Each piece hummed with a dark, almost predatory energy, reflecting the very essence of the isolated structure that housed him. It was brilliant, undeniably, but it was also profoundly disturbing. As the days blurred into a tireless creative frenzy, the faint echoes solidified. The creaks and sighs began to coalesce into something more defined, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate not just through the stones, but within his own bones. And then, the whispers. They were soft at first, like dry leaves skittering across a forgotten floor or the murmur of distant tides. But they grew clearer, distinct, weaving themselves into the fabric of his thoughts. More shadow, Chen. Deeper. The eye. It needs to see. He found himself adjusting a brushstroke, adding a layer of sepia to deepen a corner, and the result was undeniably superior, precisely what the piece had needed. The light. Too bright. A person it. A witness, the decay show. He would instinctively dull a vibrant highlight, and the painting would gain an unsettling authenticity, a chilling depth it had lacked moments before. The whispers were guiding him, pushing his boundaries, showing him techniques and perspectives he'd never considered, unlocking a terrifying wellspring of creative genius. but the guidance came with a price. Is it truly yours, Chen? Or ours? The question would slither into his mind as he stared at a completed canvas, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He'd feel a flicker of doubt, a momentary paralysis. They won't understand this. They'll call it madness. A wave of paranoia would wash over him, making him scrutinize his own work with a sudden critical eye, wondering if he was losing his grip, if the brilliance was merely a facade for something deranged. He would clench his jaw, trying to shake off the invasive thoughts, but they clung to him like barnacles. He began to feel an unnatural connection to the lighthouse. It was no longer just a building. It was a vast sentient being, and he, Chen, was merely an extension of its will. The cold stone walls seemed to pulse with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a heartbeat he could feel in his own chest. He knew when the tide was turning without looking, not through sound, but through an internal pressure, a shift in the air that felt like the lighthouse itself was drawing a breath. He'd find himself wandering its winding stairs, his hand tracing the rough-hewn stone, feeling a strange resonance, a shared history. The whispers were no longer just in his ears. They were from the house, of the house, and they were becoming his own thoughts, indistinguishable from his own creative urges. One evening, as the last vestiges of twilight bled from the sky, Chen stood before a freshly finished canvas. It depicted a figure, gaunt and skeletal, its face a blur of despair, trapped within the very walls of the lighthouse. Its hand reaching out towards a distant, unreachable light. It was magnificent, horrifying, and utterly his, yet not. He could hear the whispers now, not as distinct words, but as a chorus of overlapping voices, a low, insistent hum that filled the room. He felt an overwhelming sense of both exhilaration and profound exhaustion, as if every stroke had drawn a sliver of his soul. The lighthouse loomed around him, its presence thick and palpable, and Chen felt himself dissolving into it, an artist consumed by his muse, his genius forged in the crucible of its dark embrace. The lighthouse had taken him, a colleague with a sudden, violent pull, but with the insidious creeping tendrils of a slow-acting poison. Days bled into weeks, marked less by the sun's arc than by the shifting shadows in the tower and the increasingly frantic strokes of Chen's charcoal. He'd arrived seeking inspiration, a grand, desolate muse, and the lighthouse had answered with a whisper that had quickly grown into a roar inside his skull. The first visions were subtle, easy to dismiss as fatigue or the tricks of a lonely mind. A flicker in the periphery, a shape coalescing in the gloom of the spiral staircase, only to dissolve when he turned his head. But soon, they became bolder, demanding his attention. He'd be sketching, absorbed in the intricate patterns of decay he was capturing from the lighthouse's crumbling walls, when the very lines on his paper would seem to writhe. A patch of mildew on the wall would bloom into a grotesque multi-eyed flower, its petals unfurling to reveal a gaping maw. The shadows cast by the setting sun through the grimy panes would stretch and twist into gaunt, skeletal figures, their elongated limbs reaching, always reaching, towards him. He saw them in the reflection of his own unblinking eyes in the dark glass of the lamp room, a skeletal hand reaching over his shoulder, its fingers, long and delicate as dried reeds, tracing the faint lines of his collarbone. He saw them in the swirling patterns of his coffee cup, faces contorted in silent screams, their features dissolving into the murky liquid. He'd blink, hard, and they would be gone, leaving only the unsettling echo of their presence. A chill that had nothing to do with the sea air seeping through the old stone. These visions, macabre and vivid, were not a distraction. They were his new wellspring. His art, once stark and atmospheric, now pulsed with a frantic, desperate energy. His sketchbooks, once filled with the raw beauty of the coast, now teemed with monstrous forms, distorted visages, and landscapes of utter desolation. He drew figures trapped within walls, their faces pressed against stone, eyes wide with terror. He rendered the lighthouse itself as a living, breathing entity, its windows like empty sockets, its beacon a single baleful eye. He used more reds, more blacks, the charcoal tearing at the paper as if trying to rip through to another dimension. The work was consuming him, a feverish obsession that left him drained yet exhilarated. An agent became a luxury he could not afford. When he did drift off, the dreams were worse than the waking visions. Immersive, suffocating landscapes of rot and despair, where the very air tasted of grave dust and the sound of his own screams was swallowed by the crushing silence. He'd wake with a gasp, his heart hammering, his body slick with cold sweat, only to find the same figures from his dreams lingering in the corners of his vision, fading slowly like mist. His phone, once a lifeline, became an annoyance. A guard from his sister, Clara, went unanswered for days. When he finally picked up, her voice, tinny and distant, expressed concern. "Chen, you sound off. And your art? It's getting really dark. Are you eating? Are you sleeping?" He scoffed, his voice rough from disuse. "Never been better, Clara. The work is incredible. You wouldn't understand." He heard her sigh, a sound of profound worry. "Just come home for a bit, Chen. This place, it's not good for you." "It's perfect," he snapped, a surge of irrational anger coursing through him. "This place is me now." The line crackled, then died, a sudden sharp silence. He stared at the dead phone, a strange relief washing over him. It wasn't his fault. The signal was just bad out here. The house was helping him. An old friend, a fellow artist named David, tried to reach him next. A figure had seen some of Chen's new digital pieces, shared on an art forum before Chen had retreated completely. "Chen, man, are you okay? These new pieces? They're intense. A little unsettling, even for you. Are you seeing things? You sound a bit paranoid." Chen bristled. "Paranoid? I'm seeing truth, David. A person you're too blind to comprehend. You think your pretty landscapes matter when the world is crumbling?" He ended the call abruptly, his fingers shaking slightly. He didn't need their platitudes, their mundane concerns. They couldn't understand the depths he was plumbing, the raw, visceral beauty he was unearthing. They were anchors, trying to drag him back to a world of mediocrity. The house seemed to aid in his isolation. The old phone line, already temperamental, now seemed to fail precisely when someone called. The gravel path leading up to the lighthouse became increasingly treacherous, loose stones and thick mud making it impassable for any casual visitor. The weather, too, turned against him, the sea churning into a furious gray expanse, the wind howling around the tower like a banshee, making any journey into town feel like an expedition into a hostile wilderness. Days blurred into a single extended vigil. He stopped checking the time, stopped eating regular meals, his gaunt face reflected in the dark glass of the lamp room, eyes wide and bloodshot, hair matted, clothes stained with charcoal and paint. He was alone, utterly and completely. And a part of him, the part that had once craved company and connection, now welcomed it. The house had shown him the truth, a truth too terrible and beautiful for the outside world. And it was protecting him, sheltering him in its cold embrace so he could continue his sacred, horrifying work. The isolation wasn't a punishment. It was a privilege. He was the only one left to bear witness. The days since his colleague's sudden, inexplicable departure had not bled into an indistinguishable haze for Chen. Instead, each hour had sharpened, honing a raw edge of an unsettling curiosity. The lighthouse, with its constant mournful groan of wind and waves, felt less like a monument to maritime safety and more like a vast, stone-cold maw. He had witnessed the shift in his colleague, the rapid descent from meticulous order to a frantic, almost violent creative surge, followed by a terrifying stillness. And now, Chen felt a nascent, insidious pull himself, a quiet hum beneath his skin. It wasn't a creative burst, not yet, but a persistent whisper, drawing him deeper into the structure's shadowed history. He found himself drawn to the lighthouse keeper's old office, a small, neglected room tucked away beneath the main lamp room, long abandoned to dust and sea salt decay. The air hung heavy and still, smelling of forgotten paper and damp stone. A rickety wooden desk, its surface scarred by countless years of use, stood against one wall. He ran a hand over its grimy top, then noticed a loose panel at the back, almost hidden by a stack of crumbling nautical charts. A colleague a grunt, Chen pried the panel open. Inside, tucked away from the ravages of time and the casual glance, lay a collection of brittle, leather-bound journals and yellowed newspaper clippings. They were tied with a faded ribbon, as if someone had intended to keep them safe, or perhaps ensure they were never found. A shiver traced its way down Chen's spine. This was it. The history. He carefully extracted the first journal. An agent cover was embossed with a stylized brush and palette, and the elegant script within spoke of a painter named Elias Thorne, who had taken residence in the lighthouse in the late 1800s. Elias's early entries brimmed with an almost manic joy. "The light here, it is a living thing, breathing life into his colors," he'd scrawled, his handwriting firm and confident. He described canvases blooming with unprecedented vibrancy, the sea and sky rendered with a furious, almost divine energy. Then, the tone shifted. The entries became shorter, more erratic. The light. It speaks to him. It demands more. His eyes burn with its truth. His hands ache to capture its essence, but it is too much. The colors. They are inside him now. The last legible entry was a frantic, smeared mess. "They say Chen am mad. They say his art is grotesque, but they cannot see the light. It hungers. It wants all of him." There was no mention of his departure, only the abrupt cessation of his words, a void where his life had been. Chen's fingers trembled as he picked up a newspaper clipping. A guard a few years after Elias Thorne's last entry, it reported the disappearance of a reclusive artist from the local lighthouse, presumed lost at sea. He moved to another journal, this one belonging to a musician, the figure Bellwether, who had sought solitude in the lighthouse in the 1920s to compose. Her initial entries spoke of an ethereal melody, a symphony taking form within the lighthouse's stone walls. "The very air hums with inspiration," she wrote. "Notes flow from him like water, pure and unbidden." But like Elias, her creative euphoria soon curdled. The music. It is no longer his. It is a cacophony, 1,000 discordant voices whispering from the depths, from the very stone. Chen hear it in the wind, in the waves, in the silence. It twists his melodies, makes them monstrous. Chen tried to escape it, but it is everywhere. Her final entry was barely coherent, a desperate plea. It wants to possess the harmony. It wants to become the music. Chen must leave, or Chen will cease to be. She too had vanished without a trace, a local legend of a brilliant composer driven mad by the isolation. A cold dread seeped into Chen's bones. The pattern was undeniable. A creative soul drawn to the lighthouse. An intense burst of inspiration, followed by a descent into madness, and then disappearance. He thought of his colleague, the sudden, violent surge of creation, the unsettling glint in his eyes. A person Clara's journal, Chen found a loose, brittle page, distinct from the others. It was not a journal entry, but a single, desperate letter, its ink faded to a sepia whisper. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible, but the words, when he finally deciphered them, struck him like a physical blow. To whoever finds this, it began, "Do not be seduced. This place does not inspire, it consumes. It finds your passion, your art, your very essence, and it drains you dry, leaving only an empty vessel. It feeds on creation, on the soul's fire. The light you see, the inspiration you feel, it is not from within you. It is the lighthouse, awakening to devour. It will make you brilliant, yes, but only to make your eventual fall more profound. You must leave. A witness, it takes your mind, your work, your very self. Do not become another echo in its stone heart." The page ended there, unsigned, a desperate warning from an unknown, forgotten soul. Chen dropped the page as if it had burned him. The air in the small room grew heavy, suffocating. The lighthouse, which had felt merely ancient and imposing moments before, now felt truly alive, a malevolent entity with a ravenous hunger. He looked around the dusty room, seeing not just a forgotten office, but a tomb. The wind outside howled, a long, drawn-out wail, and for the first time, Chen felt not just curiosity, but profound, soul-shaking terror. The lighthouse wasn't just a place of disappearance, it was a place of consumption. And he was standing right in its maw. The days since his colleague's sudden, inexplicable departure had not bled into an indistinguishable haze for Chen. Instead, each hour had sharpened, becoming a distinct, often agonizing point on a timeline that stretched towards an unknown, terrifying horizon. His hands, once tools of precise creation, now trembled with an undercurrent of unease that had nothing to do with fatigue. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, within the hallowed space of his studio, the topmost chamber of the lighthouse. A canvas, one of his most recent, depicted a tempest-tossed ship, its sails shredded, battling an angry, bruised sky. Chen remembered the exact shade of crimson he'd mixed for the dying light on the horizon. Yet, as he passed it one morning, the crimson seemed deeper, richer, like a fresh wound. He dismissed it as a trick of the shifting light, or his own overtired eyes. A colleague came the sculptures. A piece carved from ancient driftwood, meant to evoke the skeletal remains of a sea creature, seemed to shift its posture. A gnarly, twisted branch, which had been angled upwards, now appeared to droop slightly. As if weighted by an invisible despair, Chen ran his hand over the wood, feeling the familiar grain, but the sensation was wrong, somehow colder, more brittle. He swore he heard a faint, rasping sigh emanate from its form, like the breath of something long dead. The changes escalated. The eyes of painted figures in his portraits, once fixed in static gazes, now seemed to follow him as he moved, their expressions subtly twisting from sorrow to a chilling malevolence. One particularly disturbing piece, a mosaic of broken glass depicting a screaming face, began to hum with a low, dissonant vibration that set his teeth on edge. He could almost hear faint, fractured whispers emanating from the shards, too indistinct to form words, yet undeniably present. His magnum opus, the sprawling, multi-paneled triptych of the encroaching darkness, became a living, breathing entity. An agent within the painting deepened and crawled, extending beyond the canvas onto the stone walls, dancing with a life of their own. The figures depicted within, once frozen in their terror, now appeared to writhe, their painted mouths opening in silent, perpetual screams that Chen swore he could almost hear, a phantom echo in the silence of the lighthouse. The lighthouse itself, once a sanctuary, turned against him. It started with the doors. The heavy, iron-bound door to his studio, which he always left ajar, would slam shut with a thunderous crack that rattled the very foundation of the tower. He'd rush to open it, only for it to slam again moments later. Tools, brushes, and pots of paint. left carefully on his workbench, would suddenly fly across the room, striking the opposite wall with startling force, sometimes narrowly missing his head. He found himself ducking instinctively, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. One evening, as a storm raged outside, mirroring the chaos within, a small, intricate clay bird, a gift from his departed colleague, lifted from its perch on a shelf and shattered against the stone floor, its delicate pieces scattering like bone fragments. Chen stared at the wreckage, a cold dread seeping into his bones. This was no trick of the mind. This was real. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The temperature within the tower plummeted, a chill that no fire could ever dispel. He began to see them. Faint, spectral figures, like distortions in the air, manifesting in his peripheral vision. They were not solid, not fully formed, but rather shimmering outlines, fleeting blurs of movement in the shadows. Sometimes they resembled the tormented faces from his own canvases, their forms elongated and indistinct, like reflections in warped glass. Agar times, they were slender, almost graceful, moving with a mournful, undulating sway, like seaweed caught in an unseen current. He would catch a glimpse, a flicker of movement at the edge of his sight, a shadow detaching itself from the wall, only to vanish when he turned his head fully. They never spoke, but their presence was a suffocating weight, an omnipresent audience to his spiraling terror. He imagined them as echoes, perhaps of those who had met their end in these lonely waters, or perhaps, more chillingly, manifestations of the despair and malevolence he had inadvertently poured into his own art. A figure became a forgotten luxury. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every howl of the wind, every unidentifiable sigh that seemed to emanate from the very walls was a fresh torment. His art, once his solace, was now his prison, its creations his tormentors. He was trapped in a stone cage with his own escalating madness and the entities it had awakened. The lighthouse was no longer just a place. It was a hungry, breathing maw, and Chen, with his brushstrokes and clay, had fed it. Chen's senses were screaming. The subtle shifts in the house, once dismissed as creaks and drafts, now felt like conscious movements. He had to leave. The thought was a raw, undeniable command from the deepest part of his mind. He strode to the front door, his hand reaching for the ornate brass handle. It was cold, strangely slick. He twisted it. Nothing. The lock, which he distinctly remembered leaving unsecured, was now stubbornly engaged. He rattled the handle, then shoved against the heavy oak. The door didn't budge, feeling as though it had been cemented into its frame. He moved to the nearest window, a tall, arched pane overlooking the overgrown garden. He tried the latch, but it was rusted solid, fused to the frame like an ancient scar. He slammed his palm against the glass, expecting the satisfying thud of solid material. Instead, it was like striking a wall of dense, unyielding rock. A colleague, a tremor, not a vibration. He moved from window to window, each one a duplicate of the last. Impassable, impenetrable. A cold dread seeped into his bones, colder than the sea wind he imagined outside. He tried the back door, leading to what he thought was the old kitchen garden. It was the same, locked, sealed, immovable. A rising panic, a frantic energy, spurred him through the echoing halls. He tried every exit point he could remember, every door, every window. Each attempt met with the same implacable resistance. It wasn't just that they were locked. It was as if the very concept of leaving was being rejected by the structure itself. The house pulsed around him, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in his teeth. A agent came the insidious thought, a cold tendril coiling around his sanity. It doesn't want him to leave. The realization was not a sudden burst, but a slow, agonizing dawning. It began with the subtle shifts in the air, the way the shadows seemed to deepen and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. It was in the way the silence hummed, not with emptiness, but with a palpable presence. The house wasn't just old and neglected, it was alive. And it was malevolent. Chen stood in the main hall, his breath ragged. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, then at the peeling wallpaper, the faded tapestries. They weren't just decaying, they were withering. A guard the house was slowly consuming itself, or rather, consuming something within itself. And then, the true horror of it struck him. His own mind, once a vibrant landscape of ideas and artistic ambition, felt thin. His recent sketches, once brimming with raw energy, now seemed lifeless, devoid of the spark that had driven him. His thoughts, once sharp and focused, now drifted, fragmented, like smoke. He felt a profound emptiness where his creative drive used to reside. It was being siphoned, drained, not by external forces, but by the very walls around him. The house was a parasitic entity, a vast, hungry maw that fed on the essence of creativity, on the vibrant energy of the human mind, on sanity itself. He was its latest victim, lured by its deceptive promise of solitude and inspiration, only to be slowly, meticulously consumed. The understanding hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air in the oppressive quiet. He was trapped, and the house was savoring his slow decay. A figure lent him a clarity, a frantic need to understand. If this was a predator, what was its origin? What ancient horror birthed such a monstrous appetite? He stumbled through the house, no longer seeking escape, but truth. He found himself drawn to the oldest part of the structure, a section he had rarely explored. The base of the disused lighthouse tower that rose from the eastern side of the house, a grim, blind eye to the sea. The door to the tower's base was unlatched, almost invitingly so, a stark contrast to the sealed exits. He pushed it open to reveal a narrow, winding staircase descending into darkness. He fumbled for his phone, its flashlight beam a fragile spear against the encroaching gloom. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient, like old blood and forgotten iron. The stairs ended in a small, circular chamber, clearly not part of the original house plans. It felt older, far older, built of rough-hewn stone that seemed to absorb the light. A person into the walls were crude, disturbing pictograms, figures with elongated limbs, heads thrown back in silent screams, lines converging on a central swirling vortex. A witness them, etched into a stone slab that served as an altar, was a single leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth, its pages brittle with age. Chen picked it up, his fingers trembling. The script inside was archaic, but familiar symbols of sacrifice and communion leaped out at him. It spoke of a deep hunger, a stone heart, that craved the vibrant essence of awakened minds. It detailed rituals, not of worship, but of feeding. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a carefully constructed cage, a beacon designed to draw in those with a creative spark, a vessel to hold and slowly drain them. The lighthouse tower above wasn't for guiding ships. It was a conduit, a lure, focusing the entity's predatory gaze, drawing in its prey from across the barren sea. The book spoke of a forgotten coastal cult, driven mad by the entity's whispers, who had built this place centuries ago, binding the deep hunger to the very stones of the house. They had intended to control it, to harness its power, but had instead become its first meal. Their faded, desperate warnings filled the pages, speaking of an insatiable void, a parasitic consciousness that had existed long before humanity, a primal entity that had found its perfect trap in this isolated dwelling. Chen dropped the book, the thud echoing unnaturally in the small space. He wasn't just trapped in an old house, he was entombed in a living prison. a monument to an ancient, forgotten horror that was slowly, patiently devouring his soul. The silence of the chamber was suddenly deafening, filled with the unspoken promise of his own eventual, complete obliteration. He was not merely a guest. He was sustenance. Chen's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising crescendo of the lighthouse's groans. The very walls seemed to constrict, the air thick with a silent, hungry pressure. He had to act, to fight, before the suffocating weight crushed him entirely. His gaze, wild and desperate, fell upon the canvases. His canvases, the ones that had started it all. They pulsed with a faint, malevolent light, mirroring the oppressive atmosphere, their dark hues deepening, swirling with an unnatural energy. He had poured his despair, his darkest visions, his very essence into them. And now, they were the anchors, the conduits, feeding the monstrosity that had consumed this place. He lunged for the nearest painting, a depiction of the lighthouse's beam cutting through an impossibly stormy blood-red sea. Skeletal figures grasping at the light. He tore at it, nails scraping against the hardened oil paint. The canvas shrieked, a sound not of tearing fabric but of tortured wood and straining metal, echoing the lighthouse's own agony. The structure groaned in response, a deep, resonant rumble that shook the very foundations. A colleague rained from the ceiling, gritty and ancient. A sudden, violent gust of wind, though all windows were sealed, ripped through the room, throwing him back against a cold stone wall, the impact jarring his teeth. The painting shimmered, its dark colors deepening, becoming more vibrant, more alive. It was not just paint and canvas. It was part of the entity now, a node of its power. He tried again, grabbing a heavy, ornate brass lantern from a nearby shelf. He swung it, a desperate, wild arc aiming for the canvas. An agent it could connect, an invisible force snatched the lantern from his grasp, tearing it from his numb fingers. It clattered across the stone floor, its glass shattering with a mournful chime. The paintings were untouchable, protected by the house's malevolent will. He couldn't just destroy them. They were too deeply integrated, too much a part of the horror. They weren't merely objects. They were extensions of the entity, feeding it, growing stronger with every pulse of his fear, every beat of his frantic heart. Frantic, Chen stumbled back, his breath ragged, lungs burning. A guard assault was futile. He needed a different approach. A weakness, an Achilles heel. The thought ignited a desperate spark in the suffocating darkness of his mind. If his art had created this monstrosity, if his despair had given it form and power, then perhaps the key to its undoing lay within its creation, or within the very history of this cursed place. He scrambled towards his makeshift studio corner, overturning stacks of blank canvases, spilling tubes of paint and brushes across the floor. He needed his research notes, the historical texts he'd compulsively devoured when first drawn to the lighthouse's desolate beauty. He remembered vague, unsettling passages, local legends of a binding, of the sea's forgotten dew, of a light that must never extinguish. Nonsense, he'd thought then, the ramblings of superstitious fishermen. Now they were desperate clues, lifelines in an ocean of encroaching madness. He found a worn, leather-bound journal, his own meticulous handwriting filling its pages, interspersed with photocopied snippets of archaic script he'd found in forgotten archives. His eyes darted across the pages, searching for anything, a symbol, a phrase, a ritual. The lighthouse pulsed around him, its heartbeat growing stronger, more predatory, its walls closing in. A figure writhed in the corners of his vision, coalescing into indistinct, hungry forms. He found it. A passage he had dismissed as poetic flourish. The person of the mariner, once kindled, demands its sacrifice. A witness light once corrupted can only be quenched by the blood of its creator, or the true light of a dawn that never breaks. And then a diagram, a circle bisected by a wavy line, surrounded by what looked like ancient runic symbols with a specific instruction. To sever the tether, the heart of the shadow must be exposed to the first light of its own undoing. What did that mean? Blood of its creator? His blood? A sacrifice? True light of a dawn that never breaks? A metaphor? Or was it something literal, something he could manipulate? The diagram. It looked like the great lens of the lighthouse, but with something else. A specific focus point. And the runes. He recognized them from his corrupted art, subtle details he'd incorporated without fully understanding their original meaning. They were not merely decorative. They were components of the binding, integral to the entity's power. The heart of the shadow. Where was it? His art? The very lens of the lighthouse? The phrase, first light of its own undoing, echoed in his mind. A officer the sun, then. A detective, else. A light he had created, perhaps. Or twisted. He looked up at the spiraling stairs leading to the lantern room. The eye of the mariner. The main lens. That had to be it. The source of the light, now corrupted. And the runes, the binding symbols he had unknowingly woven into his dark art, they were the key. He had to reverse them, to break the tether. But how? He needed to get to the lantern room, and he needed to understand how to expose the heart of the shadow to this first light of its own undoing. The answer, he realized with a chilling certainty, lay in manipulating the very corruption he had birthed. He had to paint again. But this time, not to create, but to uncreate. A ritual of reversal, using the entity's own language against it. The stairs to the lantern room seemed to stretch into an endless, terrifying void, but Chen had a direction, a desperate, terrifying hope. He clutched the journal, his knuckles white, and began his ascent, the house itself groaning in protest, sensing his newfound dangerous resolve. Chen's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising crescendo of the lighthouse's groans. The very walls seemed to constrict, the air growing thick and heavy, pressing in on him like a physical weight. The whispers, once a subtle undercurrent, now roared in his ears, a cacophony of lost voices, of unfulfilled ambitions, of the yearning that had drawn so many to this desolate tower. He stood at the apex, the lens of the great lamp above him, dark and dead, yet radiating a cold, malevolent hum. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with a deeper, intuitive sense. The entity wasn't a creature of flesh and bone, but a coalesced hunger, a voracious void that fed on the spark of creation itself. It was the antithesis of art, consuming potential, twisting inspiration into despair. It had drawn him here, as it had drawn countless others, not to destroy them outright, but to drain them, to absorb the vibrant energy of their artistic souls. The lighthouse, meant to guide, had become a trap, its light extinguished to better ensnare. A chill, deeper than any winter night, seeped into his bones. The air around the dormant lens shimmered, forming vague, indistinct shapes. A painter's discarded brush, a poet's torn manuscript, a musician's shattered instrument. A colleague were the ghosts of stolen dreams, of creative essences devoured. And it wanted his. It wanted the vibrant, raw power that pulsed within him, the drive that compelled him to capture the world's beauty and its terror on canvas. "You want it," Chen rasped, his voice barely audible above the psychic din. His art, his soul. The air thrummed in response, a silent affirmation that vibrated through his teeth. It wasn't just his current art, he realized with a sickening lurch, but the potential for all his future work. It wanted to consume the very wellspring of his inspiration, He looked down at the canvas he had carried, carefully wrapped, all the way up the winding stairs. It was meant to be his masterpiece, the grand culmination of his journey, a painting that would finally capture the desolate majesty of the lighthouse, its tragic beauty. He had envisioned it bathed in the first light of dawn, a symbol of enduring hope. Now it felt like a sacrifice, a bait. A terrible clarity dawned upon him. To fight this thing he couldn't create. He had to uncreate. He had to deny it the very thing it craved, and in doing so, weaponize the energy of creation itself, turning it inward against the entity, against the corrupted heart of the lighthouse. He unwrapped the canvas. It was blank, primed, waiting for the first stroke. This was the most terrifying thought. To destroy not a finished work, but a future one, the embodiment of his highest aspirations. It was a symbolic death, a severing of a part of his artistic soul. The entity seemed to sense his intent. The whispers intensified, morphing into taunts, into promises of eternal inspiration if only he would yield. An agent flickered at the edge of his vision. His greatest triumphs, critical acclaim, a life of artistic fulfillment. It tried to seduce him, to distract him, to make him surrender his creative power willingly. But Chen stood firm. He gripped the canvas, his knuckles white. This wasn't just a piece of stretched linen. It was the embodiment of his artistic future, the vessel for his unpainted dreams. To destroy it was to tear a hole in his own being. Yet, it was the only way. He tore at the canvas with a primal scream, a guttural sound that ripped from his chest. The thick fabric resisted, but he pulled and twisted, his strength fueled by a desperate, terrifying resolve. Ripe! The sound echoed in the confined space, a defiant retort to the entity's silent hunger. He tore again and again, until the pristine surface was nothing but ragged strips, crumpled and ruined. A shriek, not from him, but from the very air, tore through the lighthouse. It was a sound of pure agony, of outrage, of a being denied its feast. The spectral shapes around the lens writhed and dissolved. The oppressive weight in the air lessened for a moment, then redoubled, as if the entity was focusing all its power, its malevolence, to crush him. Chen didn't stop. He grabbed his paints, his brushes, his charcoal sticks, every tool he had brought, every extension of his creative self. A guard, a raw, desperate fury, he began to smash them against the metal housing of the great lamp, against the very walls of the tower. He wasn't creating, he was unmaking. He wasn't painting, he was obliterating. Each shattered tube of paint, each splintered brush, each crumbled charcoal stick released a jolt of energy, a burst of creative potential that was being violently, deliberately released into the corrupted heart of the lighthouse. He was channeling the power of his artistic destruction. The entity recoiled, its formless presence flickering like a dying flame. It was being overwhelmed, not by light, but by the raw, untamed force of creative energy unleashed without purpose, without direction, a chaotic storm of potential that it could not absorb, could only repel. As he smashed the last of his brushes, a final, agonizing crack, the great lens above him began to hum, not with malevolence, but with a resonant thrum of pure, untainted energy. A blinding flash erupted from its depths, not a steady beam, but a pulse of pure white light that surged outward, a destructive force of purity. It wasn't the light of a beacon guiding ships. It was the light of a lighthouse purging itself, violently expelling the darkness that had consumed it. The light seared Chen's eyes, burned his skin. He stumbled back, shielding his face. The air around him crackling with immense power. The whispers died, replaced by a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the tower. He felt a profound emptiness open up within him, a void where his artistic certainty had once resided. The sacrifice was made. The part of him that sought beauty in the dark, that was drawn to the melancholic allure of places like this, was gone, burned away in the cleansing fire. When the light faded, the silence that followed was absolute, terrifying in its completeness. The air was thin, cold, and utterly still. The oppressive presence was gone. The lighthouse stood, a silent sentinel hollowed out. And Chen, standing amidst the wreckage of his art, was a changed man, an artist reborn, or perhaps irrevocably broken. The sudden, deafening silence was more terrifying than any scream. The crescendo of groans, the grinding of stone, the impossible contortion of timber, it had all ceased. Chen lay sprawled on the cold, damp floor, his limbs screaming with a pain that was both raw and strangely distant. The air, thick moments ago with the scent of brine and something far more ancient and foul, now felt thin, almost sterile. He pushed himself up, every muscle protesting, his head throbbing. The entity, whatever impossible form it had taken in its final desperate struggle, was gone. Or perhaps it had simply receded, retreating into the very fabric of the lighthouse, leaving behind only the echo of its passage. The tower was broken. A colleague collapsed, but utterly, irrevocably defiled. Agent fissures snaked up the inner walls, like old scars on petrified flesh. A guard, motes danced in the slivers of weak, pre-dawn light that pierced through newly opened gaps in the stonework. The circular staircase, once a symbol of ascent, now spiraled upwards into a void of shattered glass and twisted metal where the lantern room had been. The sea wind, previously a distant whisper, now whistled through the gaps, a mournful, hollow sound that seemed to carry the lighthouse's dying breath. Chen stumbled, one foot dragging, towards the gaping maw that had once been the main entrance. The heavy oak door was splintered, half ripped from its hinges, hanging askew like a broken jaw. He didn't look back, not truly. His eyes were fixed on the gray expanse of the sky, on the promise of the horizon. Each step was an agony, a battle against the leaden weight of his own body and the crushing weight of what he had witnessed. The salt-laced air on his face felt like a brutal slap, a reminder of a world that had continued, oblivious, while he had descended into an abyss. He reached the rocky shore, his knees buckling. The waves crashed against the jagged stones, a rhythmic, indifferent sound. He collapsed onto the cold, wet sand, letting the spray wash over his face, tasting salt and something metallic that might have been blood. He lay there for an eternity, watching the first hesitant rays of the sun paint the sky in bruised purples and grays. The lighthouse, a jagged, ruined silhouette behind him, seemed to shrink with each passing moment of light, its monstrous presence temporarily subdued by the returning world. But the world was not the same. He was not the same. In the weeks and months that followed, Chen tried to return to his life, to his art. He rented a small studio in a quiet coastal town, far from the desolate stretch of land where the lighthouse stood. He bought new canvases, fresh tubes of paint. But his hand, once so steady and precise, now trembled. The vibrant colors he once favored seemed garish, hollow. His eyes, once quick to capture the subtle interplay of light and shadow, now saw something else entirely. He saw the lines of the grotesque in everyday objects. The gnarled root of a tree became a grasping, skeletal hand. The swirling patterns in a cup of coffee revealed unsettling faces, fleeting and malicious. The shadows in his studio were no longer mere absence of light, but lurking forms, shifting and breathing just beyond the edge of perception. His art became a frantic, desperate attempt to capture this new, terrible reality. His canvases exploded with tortured forms, with hues that seemed to bleed into each other, reflecting the internal chaos he now carried. The human figures he painted were no longer serene or idealized. They were gaunt, their eyes wide with unspoken horrors, their skins stretched thin over a skeletal framework that seemed to whisper of the monstrous beneath. He painted the lighthouse over and over, not as the majestic structure it once was, but as a cyclopean eye, a gaping maw, a monument to a forgotten god of terror. A figure who saw his new work were disturbed. A person called it genius, a raw, unflinching look at the darkness of the human psyche. A witness recoiled, finding it too unsettling, too real. Chen didn't care what they thought. He painted because he had to, because the images clawed at his mind, demanding release. He painted because it was the only way to articulate the unspeakable truth he had unearthed in that desolate tower. He was physically free, yes. The lighthouse stood silent and broken, a testament to the struggle. But the victory felt hollow, a cruel joke. He had escaped, but he had not left the horror behind. It had burrowed deep within him, a parasitic seed that had taken root in his very soul. He had glimpsed the true nature of the world, the thin veneer over an ancient, indifferent malevolence, and that knowledge had irrevocably changed him. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake with a gasp, the phantom weight of stone pressing in, the echo of impossible groans reverberating in his ears. He would see the entity's impossible form, not in the room, but in the corners of his vision, in the patterns of his own breath. He had fought it, perhaps even vanquished it in that moment of desperate finality. But what had he become in the process? What monstrous part of himself had he awakened or embraced to survive? Chen would rise, walk to his easel, and paint until the first light of dawn, trying to exorcise the demons that now resided not in a distant lighthouse, but within the confines of his own skull. The lighthouse was dormant, forever marked, but its lingering shadow stretched far beyond the desolate shore, reaching into the deepest recesses of Chen's mind, a constant, unsettling reminder that true victory was a myth, and some horrors, once seen, could never be unseen.